I'm so pleased that we have at least a law in line with American value. I mean, this is a cancer in our value. We should not be talking about modern day slavery after what this country has gone through during the Civil War. With our own history of enslaving fellow humans, we should not be having this discussion today, but it is what it is because this has started with China joining the WTO, and everybody was so addicted to cheap consumer products, including myself. And later we find out that we have been complicit in this.
Human trafficking doesn't always take the form we first imagine. It can be found at almost any level of an organization's supply chain. What can compliance professionals do to assess human trafficking risk, and how can they leverage the resources of the organizations they work for to help root out this tragic problem? Gwen Hassan is here to help. This is Hidden Traffic.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Hidden Traffic. I am your host, Gwen Hassan, and I am super excited today to have with me Nury Turkel. Nury has a long introduction because it's well earned, so I'm going to dive in. He is not only an author of an amazing book called No Escape, The True Story of China's Genocide of the Uyghurs, but he is also a human rights advocate, a lawyer. He's the former chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, having been appointed by Nancy Pelosi. He is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he is specializing in national security, supply chain risks, trade policy. He has devoted his time, his energy, it is, you could say, his life's work to promote Uyghur human rights, including having represented a substantial number of Uyghur political refugees with their asylum applications to the United States. And for me, I geeked out when I also read that in September of 2020, he was named as one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. So I'm honored and excited to have you on the podcast today, Nury. Thank you for joining us.
Gwen, thank you so much for having me on.
Anytime. So let's jump right in. Like I told you, as we were doing our prep work, I've read the first 6 chapters, I think, of your book. I haven't finished it yet because it is heavy reading, and kind of paramount to that. Right away in the first chapter, we learn that you were born in what is a re-education camp in China. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that? I will bet you that most people are having the same reaction I did, which is, wait, a what? A camp? What is that? I don't understand. What are we talking about? So fill us in a little bit. What does that look like?
Thank you very much. As you alluded, I was born in a re-education camp during the height of China's infamous Cultural Revolution 50-some years ago. At the time, my mother was in her 3rd trimester, and she was taken to the camp because of her family connection. The Red Guards accused her of being an informant to my maternal grandfather, who was a nationalist that the government, communist government, did not like. While all this was happening, my dad, a public intellectual educator, were taken into a labor camp to perform agricultural labor. My mother gave birth while she was physically injured after sustaining injuries resulting from the physical abuses. It's sad to note this, that she gave me birth while she was still in cast, waist down.
Oh my gosh.
After I was born, we were brought back into the camp, and then several months later, we were released. That camp that I was born is very much similar to the ones described in Anne Applebaum's books about the Soviet gulags.
Okay.
So it's a kind of a replica of Stalin's gulags that locked up people that the authorities did not like for political, religious, or ethnic reasons. The camp that the international community in the modern era learned about several years ago is essentially the camps on steroids that I was born and spent the first several months of my life. What distinguished the current camp system is that this is a high-tech camps. Even though there are a lot of similarities to the camps that I was born and spent time in my early part of life in this world, for example, forcing my mother and others to go through political indoctrination, chanting Communist Party, pro-Communist Party slogans, denouncing family members, denouncing religion, renouncing religious beliefs. But the current camp that this regime, Xi Jinping's China, set up has a lot of technological aspect, a context to it. For example, before they were taken in, they had to go through DNA sampling. They also had to go through some medical examinations under the guise of the population optimization program in China. They also separate children. Lucky me that I was with my mom at the time. But now the Chinese separate individuals in a marriageable age, preventing a natural population growth, taking those who can perform labor to the labor camps, and also taking the kids away from their parents, send them to state-run orphanages. They call it boarding schools. Based on New York Times reporting, there are about 800,000 to 1 million Uyghur children have been forcibly removed from their family members and sent to the state-run orphanages or boarding schools. This is part of the reason that the United States government was compelled, specifically then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was compelled to call it genocide and crimes against humanity. There's a specific legal requirements to call it genocide, and deliberate systematic prevention of natural population growth, and also removing children from one group to another are some of the legal requirements cannot be ignored. So it's happening on multiple fronts: labor camps, prison camps, children's orphanage, and now the society people who spared the camp also not being able to live a normal life. A senior official at the State Department on the occasion of releasing annual International Religious Freedom Report said in early 2021 that Chinese government has created an open prison-like environment for those even who spare themselves from the camps that the world has not seen since the Holocaust era.
Oh my gosh, you're right. So I've heard, like in official channels, we hear about, what do they call them? Vocational training centers. That's just a euphemism, right? That is a public relations spun reference to these exact camps that you're talking about under a nicer name.
Certainly. The Chinese government is very brutal, but they are very strategic. The reason that they're doing this have a geopolitical, economic, social reasons. So initially, they think that the world will not find out. After the United Nations called them out, calling that the China set it up a no-rights zone, locking up 1 million people, they were compelled to go out to public and try to change the narrative, and euphemistically calling it vocational training centers. Okay. And this is also a problematic terminology. When they were challenged, when they were forced to explain the modern-day concentration camps that, based on the Pentagon, locked up anywhere between 2 to 3 million Uyghurs and other Turkic people, is very similar to the camps that we read in the history books that the Nazi Germany set up during the Second World War. But because of that historical reference that will make the Chinese to have a difficulty to explain, they come up with this nicer word, saying that this is a vocational training centers. We will help the detainees, or they call it trainees. To learn technical skills. This is about job creation. This is about alleviating poverty. This is about developing the local economy. And now we know that developing local economy is sending tainted products made with the slave labor to global supply chain.
So let's talk about that. I'm glad you brought that up. You mentioned that your own father, a professor of mathematics, was forced to work in a forced labor camp doing agricultural work. What kinds of goods are you seeing historically and today made with Uyghur forced labor? I know initially there had been this focus on tomato and cotton products, but it's really expanded in recent days, correct? And tell us a bit about that.
Absolutely. The forced labor has been a central part of China's campaign against the Uyghurs as long as I can remember. And this is not something new. Tragically, the international community find out about it during the pandemic, when the shortage of PPEs, medicine, and then later we find out that there's some beauty products that American consumers buy in CVS and Walmart, Walgreens, reportedly, as reported in the New York Times, made with the slave labor. So initially it's all about the wigs, face masks, apparels, electronics, and then a groundbreaking report published by an Australian think tank, ASPI, Australia Strategic Partnership Institute, and then subsequent reports published by a UK research institute that the products been sent to global consumers include cotton, melons, the fruits even, cleaning supplies, construction materials, cotton products, anything. 90% of the cotton produced in China is originated in the Uyghur homeland.
Silicone as where?
Yes, and also the polysilicon, that is the key component in the solar panels. And then also later we find out now that the pharmaceutical ingredients is also being made with slave labor. So more and more digging through, looking at open source information published on Chinese websites, the researchers were able to make a long list of products. Now some of it is part of the critical supplies that the United States government has been focusing on. In 2022, to make the matters worse, New York Times reported that the CBP seized 13 tons of shipment of human hair products that were believed to come from the Uyghur prisoners and their forced labor facilities adjacent to the camps.
Oh my gosh.
During the process of writing my book, I tried to make sense of a ballpark figure. How many women's head needs to be shaved in order to make 13 tons of wigs or human hair products? And I come up with a staggering number. And it gives you an idea that no one is spared. And this is the kind of practices that Nazi Germany used, and specifically in Dachau and Auschwitz, shaving women's hair. I mean, there are a lot of historical similarities, parallel, that shocks the conscience. And I never thought that I would be reading stuff like this in year 2023 and year 2024.
My gosh. I had no idea until I read the book that was a practice that was happening, or that human hair products were part of this scenario. What other products are we talking about? Because you mentioned the work with Australia's Strategic Policy Institute, and I know that the Congressional Executive Commission on China was also involved in some of this work, but there are some household name companies that have been tracked back to other Uyghur agricultural products. Can you tell us some of them? And do you think that it's a result of these companies not knowing that their supply chain, maybe many levels down, has a connection to Uyghur forced labor? Or are they not doing enough to find out? Or maybe it's both. I don't know. What do you think?
I believe that based on the investigative reporting, the research done on this particular topic, that the company's global brands, we're talking about more than 80 global brands, as reported by ASPE, has been engaging in forced labor practices for years. It was just a matter of them getting caught or reaching to the conscience of the global consumer communities. So what we heard initially was the apparel industry using Xinjiang cotton, and then tomato paste. Companies like Heinz ketchup was included, Coca-Cola, Nike, H&M, Tommy Hilfiger, Calvin Klein. Calvin Klein and Tommy have been in the news lately because Chinese are retaliating against. Initially, H&M also retaliated against because they made a commitment not to use Xinjiang cotton. And then later we find out that the polysilicon used for renewable energy, for example, the wafers, the solar panels, crystallized silicon cells, and the electronic components, some of it used for fancy cars that American consumers use. A few months ago, Porsche imports from China to the United States through Long Beach port were seized. We're talking about around 3,000 fancy cars. So even the dashboards, the companies like Apple, for example, any household brands, anything, in one point we would just give up going to the places to do shop. I included a conversation that I had with my son in my book, that one day we were just walking by Nike and then he wants to go in and get soccer clothes. I said, no, we cannot shop in here. He was 4 years old at the time. I had to explain to him, and it was not an easy conversation. So even myself, like companies like Hugo Boss, there is a piece that I wrote for the Newsweek magazine on the occasion of Passover, that companies like Volkswagen and Hugo Boss, in the backdrop of its horrible history, one is making the cars for the Nazi regime and providing uniform in the case of Hugo Boss, still engaging in this kind of unethical business practices. So United States Congress and the decision makers in the executive branch and essentially said, no, this cannot happen. We need to find a way to stop it. But it's been an uphill battle. Even the law that the U.S. Congress passed, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, with a bipartisan support in September 2020, and then later eventually become a law in December 2021, addressed some of these problems, but it has not addressed the problem which has a global ramifications. Because you cannot just stop this practice banning products made in Xinjiang under the rebuttable presumption coming to the United States. What about Europe? What about Japan? What about Australia? What about Canada? I just came back from Canada speaking at an international security conference, and this was one of the key topics because products are coming to the United States through land and railroads from Canada and Mexico. Even though USMCA bans forced labor produced products, because this law has not been kind of in a bilateral, multilateral fashion being enforced, the products are still coming to our country through Europe, through Canada and Mexico. So we have this powerful law that has waken up the corporate boardrooms, resulting in some of those companies to talk to the lawyers. There are several high-profile lawyers, white shoe law firms, have a specialized group addressing, which is a good thing. You know, when somebody's talking to lawyers, it could be a good sign that they're taking it seriously. But we have a long way to go. This has been an uphill battle. I'm so pleased that we have at least a law in line with American value. I mean, this is a cancer in our value. We should not be talking about modern-day slavery after what this country has gone through during the Civil War. With our own history of enslaving fellow humans, we should not be having this discussion today, but it is what it is because this has started with China joining the WTO, and everybody was so addicted to cheap consumer products, including myself. And later we find out that we have been complicit in this.
I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, a compliance conference, and was seated next to a woman who was wearing a lovely skirt. And I commented on it to her and said, wow, I really like your skirt. That's really pretty. And she said, thanks. I got it from Shein. And I couldn't help myself, Nury. I had to say, well, you do realize that Shein has actually been identified as one of the key violators of, the UFLPA and their use of forced labor sourced cotton. And she was horrified. And I'm sure kind of, I don't know, maybe a little bit taken aback that I called her out on her fashion choices. But once you know, it's really hard to not say something to someone because she had no idea.
Absolutely. You raised something very important. I talked about inadequate enforcement of the significant law. There's one additional aspect that the United States Congress is trying so hard to address, which is something called de minimis. It is a Latin word. Under the existing trade laws, the United States government, CBP, does not inspect any goods under the value of $800. With that exemption, the companies like Shein and Temu dumping forced labor produced products to the United States. If it was not for fentanyl crisis, lawmakers and decision makers will not probably be paying attention to this. Traditionally, this is something that the US government thought might help to facilitate quick shipment and allowing the American consumers to receive their products faster. But what Shein and Temu has been doing was not something that was initially expected. Just 1 year before, this was something that didn't get attention by the lawmakers is because until recently, it was about $100 million products coming to the United States. Now we're talking about over $1 billion. Wow. Every day, $2-3 million worth of products being dumped and arrive to the United States without inspection.
Because they're coming in under that de minimis exception where it's a small value shipment. Is that
exactly?
And so there's just more volume of small volume shipments. They're making up for like volume size in dollars by volume in like repeated orders.
Absolutely.
Okay.
U.S. Congress is trying to force these companies to disclose in their SEC filings that if their products are tainted with forced labor, they're getting smart. They didn't go to their route and trying to take their business to UK. They're trying to go public in UK and also facing some pushback. So unless the United States government closed this loophole, as you can imagine, there's an army of well-funded, very aggressive lobbying efforts. Some of them includes companies like FedEx that brings the goods to the United States.
Oh.
And there are law firms doing the bidding for these people. And it makes it more difficult for the White House and Congress to do something meaningful. I had the pleasure of testifying at a field hearing last year organized by the Ways and Means Committee, and this was the topic. And this was the issue. We had a field hearing in New York because this is affecting and now we're losing about 80,000 Americans every year to fentanyl. That's a lot of number. It's more death caused by traffic accidents in the United States. So Congress and the executive branch, the White House is very, very concerned, but our government has not figured out the way to close this loophole. To me, we need to get rid of it. But there's some discussion today in Washington that they are looking to reduce the 800 exemption to a lower number.
I would not have thought that there could be a connection between fentanyl and forced labor, but if people are using the low dollar exception amount to avoid inspection, what you're saying is they can ship fentanyl in small amounts into the US as well. So it's kind of bleeding over into the other area, into forced labor as well.
And this is one of the ways that the Chinese government has been persuading our policymakers that in order to cooperate with China on public health crises such as fentanyl crisis and also climate crisis, we had to tone down our criticism of the CCP. So in the past couple of years, there has not been a vocal critique in a public discourse, public arena, calling the Chinese out. The fentanyl crisis is something that American people need to be mindful of because the Chinese are still, with all the commitments that it made, starting from the previous administration, making this as an illicit drug, but it's still coming to the United States through Mexico. The Chinese government is capable of monitoring even the forced labor products because it's a surveillance state. Anything going in and out, every aspect of the human beings in China being surveilled. And the Uyghur lives, going back to the earlier point, how different this is like a tech genocide. They are the cameras. We're talking about 4 million surveillance cameras within China. And if that market is saturated, they're looking for another countries or regions to adopt their surveillance techniques. And this has also anti-democratic aspect, in addition to hurting United States' long-term economic interest and making us complicit in this modern-day slavery.
So if a company is complying with, making all the best efforts to comply with the UFLPA, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, what I'm hearing from you is that might be a good start, but it's not enough. What do you advise companies to do? I know the EU has now proposed its CSR triple D, right? The Corporate Responsibility Due Diligence Directive, which will eventually require companies to do diligence all the way back to source. Do you think that is what most companies should be aiming to comply with, even if they're not doing business in Europe, because it's the higher standard that we're headed towards? What are your thoughts?
As a compliance lawyer, I can say this. The first thing first, we need to put in place a very strict compliance programs. The companies oftentimes focus on anti-bribery, antitrust, workplace safety related compliance programs. But in our relationship with the suppliers, third parties, in the context of forced labor has not been adequately addressed. So I worked for a multinational corporation as a compliance counsel officer for 4 years. I've seen some movement, recognition of the problem, which is a good sign. So just like the way that we put a lot of resources, time and energy on FCPA compliance, I would love to see UFLPA compliance. Teams led by general counsel, chief compliance officer. So putting the house in order is step number one. Number two, recognizing that this is something that's not going to go away. I would say this is just the beginning. This is one issue that the United States Congress strangely agree in a bipartisan fashion. It's hard to find somebody who disagrees that this is something need to be enhanced, amended, and adequately enforced. So the message to the corporate boardrooms is that looking at UFLPA should not be a box checking exercise. It has to be meaningful exercise, meaningful ways of addressing this problem that is much more bigger problem if you compare to FCPA. FCPA starts when the company got caught. The enforcement started. But the UFLPA is all over the place. It's already there. So I would start with that. And then the third thing that I would think is that the companies who have done something right need to share the best practice. Because of their fear of reprisal by the CCP government, some companies that I know, but I don't have a liberty to disclose their names, are not being able to share the best practices. I know for a fact that several big companies, global brands, multinational corporations, terminated their relationship with questionable suppliers, and yet they're not willing to go out in public. Because if the big guys do that, it encourages the smaller companies, mid-sized companies to follow suit. We have not seen that. And then the fourth action that the multinational corporations need to do, in addition to engaging internally, externally, highlighting the significance of following the law, the corporate executives should use their influence to pass on this message to the CCP leadership that it's good for the CCP, good for the country because it's a manufacturer-based economy, allowing these companies to do the right thing, following, complying with the US laws. In the case of PVH, it has been in the news that I had the pleasure of contributing in the New York Times, that instead of complying with the US laws, using their influence to convince the Chinese leadership that this is something must happen, they are caving in. It's untenable. It's not going to help. Anyone who follows the Chinese economic news know that the Chinese economy is struggling. Their real estate economy has suffered significantly. There's a large unemployment problem that Xi Jinping had to deal with. Their liquidated investment has been stopped. Foreign direct investment has been reduced. Even our Secretary of Commerce called China an uninvestable country. So the last remaining thing for the CCP leadership, as far as economic health is concerned, allowing them to continue to make stuff. In order to do that, they need those global brands. So actually, the companies are in a better position than those of us who are advocating for adequate compliance here in Washington to communicate directly, like, look, we have reputational risk, we have a legal risk, we have investment risk. If you continue to squeeze us, we're not only breaking the US laws, we will lose investors. That will force us to relocate to another country. Do you want us to leave? The Chinese don't want the companies to leave. And then finally, the consumers has a huge role to play. Part of the reason that we have been successful to have the Congress to put this legal tool in place and continuing to advocacy is because of consumers. When the consumers speaking out, the corporate boardrooms will hear from us. So it's extremely important. So this has to be handled in multiple fronts. And then finally, and I can't believe that I'm saying this, somebody who's been so critical of multinational corporations that have been implicated in this, that we need to intensify our commercial diplomacy in a governmental level. The European Union, the same way. If you look at Germany's treatment of this particular concern, is not helpful. We need to be able to help the companies. If the European Union or the United States or Canada and Mexico leave those companies at the mercy of the CCP leadership, that's not going to solve the problem. 90% of Apple products are still made in China. And that company can be harmed with a stroke of a pen from the leadership. And our diplomatic engagement, in addition to the climate crisis conversation, the fentanyl crisis conversation, should involve how to protect the business interest. That will be beneficial to everyone in the long term.
Nury, this has been fascinating. I feel like I have taken a college course on forced labor just through reading your book and talking with you. We are unfortunately out of time for this episode. How can people continue the conversation with you if they'd like to? Well, I mean, first of all, they can buy the book, again, No Escape, The True Story of China's Genocide of the Uyghurs. But if they wanted to reach out to you personally, how should they contact you?
I have a website, nuryturkel.com. They could contact me there. They also can follow me in my social media. I'm on Twitter, now X, just my first name, last name. And also they can sign up a newsletter for the events that I organize and speak at the Hudson Institute. We do a lot of programming on this particular topic. And also, I would encourage consumers and listeners to this podcast that be mindful of what they're buying.
Mm.
It disturbs me deeply that some of the food that I consume at home, the melon that I used to buy at Costco, dry dates, red dates from some Asian grocery stores, are made with the slave labor. On top of the baby pajamas that the Costco used to import from China, I might have bought some of that to wrap my kids at night. So the consumers need to be mindful that there are a lot of products that we deal with, consume daily, made with the slave labor, if it's made in China.
Thank you so much, Nury. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much, Gwen.